I was standing in the back of my son's wedding when I realized the bride walking toward him had my late husband's eyes. In that instant, every buried memory came rushing back, and my entire body went cold. My son thought I was there to embarrass him because I was not educated enough for his new world. But what I uncovered seconds before the vows would destroy two families, expose decades of lies, and reveal just how dangerous shame can become when people care more about status than truth. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Vivian Mercer, and for most of my life, I believed hard work could hold a family together if you gave enough of yourself to it. I believe sacrifice mattered. I believe love, when repeated consistently over decades, became strong enough to survive almost anything. I am 67 years old now, and some mornings I still wake up reaching toward the empty side of the bed where Thomas Mercer used to sleep before the silence reminds me he has been gone for 12 years. The house in Savannah feels larger since his death. Not physically larger, quiet larger. Every room carries too much air inside it now. The kitchen especially. That kitchen once smelled like cinnamon rolls before sunrise and buttercream frosting after dark because Thomas and I built our bakery from nothing but debt, exhaustion, and stubbornness. We spent 33 years waking before dawn so other people could celebrate birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, and holidays with something sweet sitting in the center of their tables. After Thomas died from a stroke behind the counter one October afternoon, everybody expected me to sell the bakery. Even Ethan did. But I kept it open because grief feels less dangerous when your hands stay busy. So I baked through the funeral. I baked through the first Christmas without him. I baked through the years when my back hurt so badly at night that I had to sit on the edge of the bathtub before standing again. I did all of it for my son. Ethan Mercer had once been the center of every dream I allowed myself to keep. When he was little, he used to sleep on sacks of flour in the bakery office while I worked late orders. Thomas would carry him upstairs afterward with the powdered sugar still dusted across his tiny sneakers. Back then, our life was not elegant, but it was warm. We were people who loved each other loudly and without embarrassment. That is why the silence unsettled me so deeply once it started. For 11 years after leaving for college, Ethan called every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes the conversations lasted 40 minutes, sometimes only 10. But the call always came. It became part of the structure of my life the same way church bells or sunrise become part of a town you have lived in long enough. Then Charleston happened. Ethan joined a prestigious corporate law firm there 3 years ago, and slowly, carefully, he began changing in ways difficult to explain out loud. The calls shortened first. Then his voice changed, polite, measured, too careful around me. He stopped asking my opinion about work or relationships or life. He stopped sounding like somebody resting emotionally inside a conversation with his mother. Last spring, on my birthday, he sent a text message instead of calling. I remember standing beside the coffee maker reading those 14 words over and over while the machine hissed steam into the kitchen. "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you enjoy your special day." That was all. I set the phone face down afterward and continued buttering toast because dignity becomes instinctive at my age. A few months later, Ethan mentioned a woman named Celeste Whitmore during one of our shorter calls. He described her as very refined. The word caught my attention immediately because it sounded borrowed somehow, like clothing that fit awkwardly across his shoulders. After that, more little things disappeared. He stopped posting photographs of us online. He avoided inviting me to work events. Whenever I asked about Charleston, he would only smile softly and say, "People are different here." Then one Sunday came without a phone call at all. I sat beside my living room window until nearly midnight, staring at my silent telephone while Savannah rain pressed softly against the glass. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding for months. Somebody was teaching my son to be ashamed of where he came from. The Sunday after Ethan missed his usual call felt strangely hollow from the moment I opened my eyes. Savannah mornings normally comforted me. The slow church bells drifting through the neighborhood, the scent of salt lingering in the humid air, the sunlight stretching itself lazily across the kitchen floorboards. But that morning, everything felt slightly off balance, as if the house itself had noticed something missing before I fully allowed myself to. I tried to be reasonable about it. People forget things. Successful men become busy. Lives expand. I repeated those thoughts while unlocking the bakery 2 hours later than usual, because I had spent most of the morning staring at my silent phone instead of preparing dough. Still, mothers know the difference between absence and avoidance. I burned an entire tray of pecan pastries before realizing I had never set the timer. That had not happened in years. Customers noticed my distraction too. One regular asked whether I was feeling sick because I forgot his order via halfway through preparing it. I laughed it off gently, but inside, something heavier had already started settling into place. All afternoon, memories kept arriving uninvited. Ethan at 23 calling me from Boston after midnight because he could not figure out how to make Thanksgiving gravy for his law school friends. Ethan sitting cross-legged on the bakery counter as a teenager, arguing passionately about courtroom ethics while powdered sugar covered his jacket sleeves. Ethan once telling me no matter how successful he became, Sunday calls would always belong to us. Now, even hearing his voice required effort. By Wednesday evening, I could no longer ignore the instinct crawling quietly beneath my ribs. I closed the bakery early, carried a cup of coffee into the back office, and called my son myself. He answered after 6 rings. "Hey, Mom." The politeness in his voice hurt more than anger would have. Everything about his tone sounded measured, careful, emotionally distant, like a man trying to complete a social obligation correctly. I asked simple questions at first: work, Charleston, his apartment. Each answer arrived short and polished, giving away nothing real. Halfway through the conversation, I heard a woman laughing faintly somewhere behind him. Ethan lowered his voice immediately afterward. That was when I stopped pretending. "What is happening between us, Ethan?" Silence answered first. Not shocked silence, thinking silence. Then finally, he exhaled softly into the phone. "I have been meaning to tell you something." My stomach tightened before he even continued. He told me he was engaged to Celeste Whitmore. Not recently, almost a year now, an entire year. 12 months of hidden dinners, holidays, photographs, plans, conversations, memories. My son had built an entirely separate life while carefully keeping me outside its walls. I gripped the edge of my desk harder. "Why did you not tell me?" Another pause followed, longer this time. "It just got complicated." Complicated. Such a clean word for something so deeply personal. Then he mentioned the wedding. A private ceremony on a luxury island resort near Hilton Head. Very formal, very exclusive. I asked quietly whether I would finally meet her family there. Everything in his voice changed after that. He started explaining instead of speaking naturally. The Whitmores were prominent. educated, deeply connected in political and legal circles across South Carolina and Georgia. They cared about appearances and social expectations. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that these were not originally his thoughts. Then came the sentence that split something open inside me. This wedding is only for educated people. The silence afterward felt enormous. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply sat there staring at the old bakery wall covered with framed photographs of Ethan through the years while my own son explained why I would not belong in the room where he planned to begin his future. He kept talking after that. Judges, attorneys, political donors, conversations I supposedly would not enjoy, places where I might feel uncomfortable. But all I could think about was being 17 years old, leaving school to care for my dying mother because there was nobody else to do it. I had never been ashamed of that sacrifice until my son taught me how shame sounds in another person's voice. That night, after locking the bakery, I stood alone studying a photograph of Ethan at 8 years old, covered in flour and smiling directly at me from behind the counter. And for the first time, I found myself wondering who benefits when a son forgets the woman who built his life. The days after Ethan's phone call passed in a strange fog I could not fully explain to anyone around me. I still opened the bakery before sunrise. I still kneaded dough, frosted cakes, smiled politely at customers, and swept flour from the counters at closing time. From the outside, my life continued exactly as it always had. Inside, something had shifted permanently. The sentence repeated itself constantly in my mind while I worked. Only for educated people. Not shouted, not said cruelly. Somehow that made it worse. Ethan had spoken those words calmly, almost carefully, like a man trying to protect someone from discomfort instead of excluding his own mother from the most important day of his life. Humiliation rarely arrives loudly at my age. It settles quietly into places you thought were already healed. I found myself staring at my own hands more often that week, the roughness across my knuckles from decades of lifting heavy baking trays, the small burn scars near my wrists, the fingers that never wore expensive rings because every extra dollar had gone toward tuition payments, rent checks, textbooks, or helping Ethan survive the years before success finally reached him. For the first time in decades, I thought about the education I never had. At 17, I left school to care for my mother while she died slowly from cancer in a small house outside Macon, Georgia. By 22, I was married. By 29, I was helping Thomas keep a struggling bakery alive during years when we barely made enough money to cover utilities. I had never regretted those choices before. Still, no matter how wounded I felt, I could not bring myself to hate my son. That was the part nobody warns you about motherhood. Even heartbreak keeps its tenderness. Deep down, something about Ethan's behavior felt unnatural to me. Forced. Constructed. The boy I raised had never mocked working people. He had grown up watching mechanics, waitresses, janitors, bakers, and dock workers keep entire neighborhoods alive through sheer exhaustion and discipline. Then came the rainstorm Thursday afternoon. The bakery had nearly emptied when my phone buzzed across the counter with Daniel Brooks's name glowing on the screen. Just seeing it tightened something unexpectedly inside my chest. Daniel had been Ethan's closest friend since high school. He practically lived in our house during those years. I fed that boy enough peach cobbler and cornbread to raise him halfway myself. His voice sounded uneasy from the beginning. He asked about my health first, then the bakery, then whether Savannah had gotten the same storms Charleston was having. None of it mattered. I could hear him circling something heavier underneath. Finally, after a long pause, he sighed quietly. "Miss Vivian, Ethan has changed a lot." I did not answer immediately. Daniel continued carefully, explaining how Ethan slowly altered everything after meeting Celeste Whitmore and her family. His clothes became sharper, his speech more polished. He stopped attending reunions with old friends from Savannah. Last year, he even skipped their high school alumni dinner because he worried it no longer fit his image. That sentence hit me almost harder than the wedding conversation had. Then Daniel mentioned Margaret Whitmore. Apparently, she once asked, during a dinner party, whether Vivian Mercer still owned that little bakery. Little bakery. Daniel repeated the phrase exactly the way she said it, and I could hear the contempt hidden beneath her polished Southern manners. But then his voice lowered further. A few weeks earlier, he accidentally saw one of the Whitmore family attorneys reviewing old genetic records connected to Ethan through an ancestry database. Daniel did not understand why lawyers would care about something like that, but he remembered it because the conversation became tense the moment he entered the room. Cold spread slowly through my stomach. Before hanging up, Daniel finally gave me the wedding information Ethan never intended for me to know. The private resort near Hilton Head, the ceremony date, the exact location. Then he said something that kept me awake nearly the entire night. I think your son is trying very hard to become somebody else. After midnight, I found myself sitting inside Ethan's old bedroom, staring at the childhood trophies lining his shelves beneath years of dust. And for the first time, I began wondering what kind of woman benefits from teaching a son to feel ashamed of his own mother. I did not sleep the night after Daniel called me. Every time I closed my eyes, pieces of the conversation returned separately instead of together. Margaret Whitmore asking about my little bakery. Ethan refusing to attend his high school reunion because it no longer suited his image. Lawyers studying genetic records connected to my son for reasons nobody explained. By 3 a.m, I gave up pretending rest was coming. I carried an old storage box from the hallway closet into the kitchen and spread its contents across the table beneath the dim overhead light. 37 years of marriage reduced to paper and photographs, bakery receipts, mortgage statements, anniversary cards, handwritten notes Thomas used to leave beside the coffee maker before opening the shop early. One photograph stopped me longest. Thomas stood behind me in our bakery kitchen with flour smeared across his cheek and one arm wrapped around my waist while we laughed at something outside the frame. We looked exhausted and happy in the way only working-class couples understand. Inside the box, folded between old insurance papers, I found a letter he wrote me during our 25th anniversary trip to Charleston. Nobody who works this hard is beneath anybody. I read that sentence 5 separate times before carefully placing the letter back down. The next several days became a quiet war inside my own mind. Part of me wanted to stay home, preserve what little pride remained, allow Ethan to build whatever polished new life he wanted without forcing myself into spaces clearly designed to exclude women like me. But another part of me understood something deeper. If I stayed away, the story would become permanent. I would become the embarrassing mother hidden quietly in the background while strangers celebrated the son I helped build. Years from now, photographs would exist proving I had been erased successfully. No, I did not raise Ethan Mercer by sacrificing my entire adulthood just to disappear politely when somebody wealthier decided I lacked the proper credentials to stand beside my own child. By Friday evening, my decision had settled fully inside me. I was going to that wedding. Not to beg for acceptance, not to humiliate my son publicly, not to create a scene. I was going because a mother has the right to stand in the room where her child begins his future. The night before the ceremony, I removed the navy dress Thomas bought me for our 30th wedding anniversary from the back of my closet. It still fit surprisingly well despite the years. Standing before my bedroom mirror, I studied the woman staring back at me carefully. The silver hair, the lines around my mouth, the tired eyes carrying decades of early mornings and grief and survival. Then I remembered Ethan's voice explaining why people like me would not feel comfortable among educated guests. I straightened my shoulders after that. The drive from Savannah began before sunrise. Thick fog rolled across the Georgia coastline while marsh grass bent gently beneath the wind. The farther I drove, the quieter my thoughts became. Pain sometimes sharpens into calm once the decision has already been made. I kept remembering Ethan as a little boy, gripping my hand tightly whenever we crossed busy streets downtown. He trusted me completely then. The loss of that trust hurt more deeply than I had admitted even to myself. By late morning, I reached the private island resort near Hilton Head. Everything about the property felt expensive in a cold, calculated way. Marble entryways, white floral arrangements, luxury cars parked beside trimmed hedges so perfect they looked artificial. I sat inside my car for several minutes, gathering myself before stepping out. That was when a young catering employee approached quietly from the side entrance. She glanced around nervously before slipping a plain white envelope into my hands. Before the vows begin, you deserve the truth. Then she walked away before I could stop her. My fingers trembled, opening the envelope back inside the car. Inside rested photocopied pages from an old genetic test. I stared at the document for several seconds before the name finally registered fully in my mind. Thomas Mercer. Cold moved violently through my chest. I did not understand everything yet, but instinct arrived before logic did. Something enormous had been hidden beneath this wedding from the very beginning. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the towering glass windows of the resort ballroom and caught my own reflection staring back at me. And deep inside, I knew my life had just divided itself permanently into before and after. The ballroom looked exactly the way wealthy people want happiness to look. Everything shimmered softly beneath golden chandeliers. White roses climbed the walls in perfect arrangements. Violin music floated gently through the room, while waiters moved silently between guests, carrying crystal glasses balanced carefully on silver trays. Even the sunlight pouring through the massive oceanfront windows looked curated somehow, warm and flattering and expensive. And standing in the middle of it all, I felt like a stain somebody hoped the lighting would hide. People noticed me immediately. Not openly. Southern wealth rarely behaves openly. But I saw the glances, the quick flickers of curiosity moving across carefully composed faces. Women in pale designer dresses studying my navy gown for signs of where I belonged socially. Men with polished smiles briefly pausing their conversations once they realized nobody important had greeted me. I kept walking anyway. Then Ethan saw me. He stood near the altar, speaking to one of the groomsmen, when his eyes lifted suddenly toward the back of the ballroom. The color drained from his face so fast it frightened me for one brief second. Shock came first, then panic, then embarrassment. He started toward me immediately, his entire body tightening with the kind of controlled urgency people use when they believe disaster has entered a room publicly. But before he reached me, the music changed. The ceremony began. Guests turned toward the entrance aisle while Ethan stopped halfway across the ballroom, trapped between me and the future waiting for him at the altar. After one final strained look in my direction, he reluctantly returned to the front beside the officiant. I stayed near the back wall, gripping my purse tightly enough for my fingers to ache. Inside my bag rested the envelope containing the genetic records. I had not fully examined the documents since opening them in the parking lot because some part of me still hoped I misunderstood what I saw. Then the ballroom doors opened. Celeste Whitmore appeared beneath a flood of soft afternoon light. At first, the feeling that moved through me was not recognition exactly, more like collision, a strange internal jolt that arrived before thought had time to organize itself around it. She was beautiful, tall, elegant, controlled in the way women raised around wealth often become. But as she moved slowly down the aisle, details began surfacing one by one like objects rising from deep water. The nervous tilt of her head, the way one corner of her mouth tightened when too many people looked at her, her eyes, dear God, Thomas Mercer's eyes. Suddenly, I was no longer standing inside a ballroom near Hilton Head. I was 29 again, standing beside Savannah Harbor while rain rolled across the docks, and a blonde woman named Elena Brooks held the hand of a little girl staring quietly toward the water. I remembered that child's face because Thomas could not stop looking at her. The memory slammed into me so violently my knees nearly buckled. I looked back toward Celeste, then toward Margaret Whitmore, seated proudly in the front row, and that was the moment everything inside me froze completely. Margaret was already watching me. Not confused, not alarmed, prepared. Her expression held the cold stillness of someone who had expected recognition, eventually, and decided long ago she could survive it. My hands began trembling uncontrollably. I pulled the genetic paperwork from my purse and forced myself to read the blurred lines again beneath the ballroom lights. Thomas Mercer listed as biological father. The room tilted sideways. All at once, every disconnected piece of the last several weeks locked together into one horrifying truth. Celeste Whitmore was Thomas Mercer's daughter, which meant the woman walking toward my son was his sister. The violin music grew distant around me. My breathing shortened painfully. Ethan stood smiling at the altar, completely unaware that his entire life was seconds away from shattering. Celeste stepped closer. The officiant opened his book, and I understood with terrifying clarity that if I stayed silent even 1 minute longer, my son would marry his own blood. Something inside me broke loose after that. The scream tore out of my chest before I fully realized it was happening. Music stopped instantly. Every head in the ballroom turned toward me. Celeste froze halfway down the aisle. Ethan spun around in horror, and looking at my son's face in that terrible moment, I realized something devastating. He still believed the worst thing inside that room was me. The ballroom exploded into confusion the moment my scream shattered the ceremony. Guests rose from their chairs all at once, voices crashing together beneath the vaulted ceiling, while the violinists lowered their instruments in stunned silence. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass shattered against the marble floor. Nobody seemed fully certain whether they were witnessing a medical emergency, a family fight, or something worse. Ethan reached me first. His face had gone pale with humiliation and panic as he grabbed my arm tightly enough to hurt. "What are you doing?" I barely heard him. My eyes stayed fixed on Celeste, standing frozen halfway down the aisle, with white roses trembling in her hands. Confusion had already begun spreading across her face, but not understanding yet. That made everything more unbearable somehow. I forced myself to breathe. Then I looked directly at my son and realized something devastating. Ethan truly did not know. Beneath all his anger and embarrassment, he stood there completely innocent of the horror unfolding around him. My voice shook when I finally spoke. "Your father had an affair years ago with a woman named Elena Brooks." Ethan blinked at me in confusion. Around us, the ballroom slowly quieted as people sensed the shape of something catastrophic forming inside the silence. I handed him the genetic documents with trembling fingers. At first, he looked irritated, almost impatient. Then his eyes moved lower across the page. The color disappeared from his face immediately. No, he whispered. Celeste slowly stepped down from the aisle toward us. Her expression had changed now. Fear had entered it. Real fear. She looked at Ethan, then at me, then finally toward Margaret Whitmore seated motionless in the front row. And suddenly Celeste understood exactly where the truth had been hiding all along. I spoke before my courage failed me completely. Celeste is Thomas Mercer's daughter. A wave of shocked murmurs spread violently across the ballroom. Ethan staggered backward like the floor had physically shifted beneath him. One hand covered his mouth, while the genetic paperwork shook uncontrollably in the other. Celeste stared at her mother. How long have you known? Margaret remained unnaturally calm at first, her spine perfectly straight despite dozens of horrified faces turning toward her from every direction. But once she realized the room had already judged her, small cracks began appearing beneath the polished surface. Quietly, almost coldly, she admitted she discovered the truth months earlier while investigating old Mercer financial records and ancestry documentation connected to Thomas. Yet she allowed the wedding to continue. The ballroom reacted with open horror after that. Then came the explanation that made everything even uglier. Thomas Mercer had established a private trust worth nearly $8 million years before his death. The inheritance was restricted to verified Mercer descendants and legal family beneficiaries. Because Celeste had never been publicly acknowledged by Thomas, Margaret believed marriage to Ethan would permanently attach her daughter to the Mercer name and secure financial access that otherwise remained uncertain. Listening to it felt like listening to somebody discuss a business merger instead of human lives. Ethan looked physically sick. Celeste looked broken. Margaret kept insisting she only wanted to protect her daughter's future, but the words sounded monstrous now inside that ruined ballroom. Then Celeste finally spoke again. You let me fall in love with my own brother. Nobody moved after that. The sentence settled over the room like smoke after an explosion. I watched Ethan collapse heavily onto the altar steps, with his face buried in his trembling hands, while Celeste's bouquet slipped from her fingers onto the marble floor beside him. And standing there in the middle of a shattered silence, I understood something terrible. No family survives the moment truth finally stops waiting. The ballroom emptied slowly after the truth came out. Nobody rushed toward the exits. Nobody raised their voice. Wealthy Southern people rarely collapse publicly. Instead, they disappeared in controlled silence, carrying their shock carefully behind stiff posture and lowered eyes. The violinists packed away their instruments without speaking. Half-finished champagne glasses remained abandoned across the reception tables. White roses still decorated the altar where Ethan had nearly married his own sister less than 20 minutes earlier. The entire room felt less like a canceled wedding and more like the aftermath of a funeral nobody expected to attend. I stood near the back wall, unable to move, for several minutes. This was never what I wanted. I came to that island because I refused to let my son erase me from his life. I never intended to destroy him publicly, but once truth enters a room, it rarely stops where people hoped it would. Ethan still sat motionless near the altar steps, with both hands covering his face. The sight of him nearly broke me. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, spiritually, like the polished, successful attorney Charleston admired had cracked open, leaving behind only the frightened little boy underneath. Celeste was guided toward a private room by one of her bridesmaids. Before disappearing through the side hallway, she looked back at me once. There was no hatred in her expression, only devastation. That hurt more than anger would have. Across the ballroom, Margaret Whitmore attempted to leave quietly, but people had already started distancing themselves from her. Men who once shook her hand warmly avoided eye contact now. Women she probably attended charity galas with stepped subtly aside as she passed. I realized then that her carefully protected reputation had begun collapsing in real time. Ethan finally stood a few minutes later. For one brief moment, our eyes met across the ruined ballroom. He looked like he wanted to speak, maybe apologize, maybe ask how any of this could possibly be real, but no words came. And for the first time in years, my son no longer looked at me like I was the embarrassing part of the room. He walked out alone. The days afterward became unbearable in quieter ways. Rumors spread quickly through Savannah and Charleston. Nobody publicly repeated the full truth, but pieces traveled fast enough on their own. A destroyed wedding, hidden DNA records, old family affairs, a secret trust fund. Somebody uploaded a short video of my scream inside the ballroom, and suddenly strangers online were discussing my grief like entertainment. I stayed silent through all of it. Meanwhile, stories about Margaret Whitmore grew darker. Internal investigators at her law firm reportedly discovered unauthorized access to private genetic databases and suspicious legal paperwork connected to the Mercer Trust. Ethan disappeared completely. No calls, no messages, no sign of where he went. That frightened me more than public humiliation ever could. One night, I sat alone inside Ethan's old bedroom, surrounded by law school books, childhood baseball trophies, and faded photographs from better years. I remembered how he used to run into my arms after losing Little League games, because he believed mothers could absorb pain simply by holding it. Now he was suffering somewhere beyond my reach. I sat in the darkness, gripping my silent phone, and wondering how much of my son still existed beneath all the shame somebody had taught him to carry. Nearly 2 weeks passed without a single word from Ethan. By then, fear had replaced anger entirely. Every night I woke around 2 or 3 in the morning and checked my phone before my eyes fully opened. The house in Savannah had become unbearably quiet again, except now every silence carried panic beneath it. I kept imagining Ethan alone somewhere, with nothing except shame and grief echoing around inside his head. When the call finally came, rain was falling softly against the bakery windows after closing. I recognized his breathing before he even spoke. He sounded exhausted, hollowed out. Ethan admitted he had been hiding inside a small rental cabin near Beaufort since the wedding collapsed. He said he could not face Charleston, could not face the law firm, could not face mirrors without seeing humiliation staring back at him. I listened quietly. Then slowly, piece by piece, he began confessing things I think he had been carrying for years. At first, he truly loved Celeste. I could hear that still. But somewhere along the way, the Whitmore family convinced him success required distance from everything ordinary. They mocked Savannah gently at first, then the bakery, then me. Margaret Whitmore once referred to me as a woman who never left her class. Ethan said he argued with her initially, but eventually the arguments became silence, and silence slowly became agreement. That was the moment his voice finally cracked. "The worst part is not what happened at the wedding," he whispered. "It is the way I started looking at you." I closed my eyes after that because no mother prepares herself to hear her child describe becoming ashamed of her. Still, beneath the pain, I recognized something important. My son had not become cruel naturally. He had been reshaped slowly by people who treated love like social currency instead of something sacred. A few days later, Celeste came to Savannah unexpectedly. She looked thinner than before, fragile almost. The confidence she carried at the wedding had disappeared completely. She told me she cut ties with Margaret after learning the full truth about the trust fund and years of manipulation. Then quietly, she admitted something that stayed with me long after she left. Her mother raised her to believe relationships existed for security, status, and protection. Love always came second. For the first time, I stopped seeing Celeste as the woman who took my son away from me. She was another damaged child standing in the ruins of somebody else's ambition. Before leaving the bakery, she asked softly, "Do you think Ethan will ever forgive himself?" I looked toward the front windows, where Ethan used to press his little hands against the glass while waiting for me to finish work years ago. Some wounds never disappear completely. They simply learn how to live quietly inside a person. After Celeste left, I stood alone inside the dark bakery, realizing something painful and true. Shame can turn love into something almost unrecognizable if you leave it untreated long enough. Nearly 2 months passed after the wedding before Ethan finally came home to Savannah. By then, life inside the bakery had regained its routine on the surface. Customers returned, morning orders filled the shelves again. Tourists still wandered through the historic district carrying coffee cups and camera bags beneath the Georgia sunlight. But healing moved slower than routine. Ethan and I spoke occasionally during those weeks, though every conversation remained careful and fragile. Shame still lived heavily inside him, and grief still lived heavily inside me. Then one cool autumn morning, I unlocked the bakery before sunrise and turned around to find him standing outside the front window. For 1 second, I barely recognized my own son. He looked thinner, exhausted. The expensive Charleston polish had disappeared completely. No tailored confidence, no rehearsed professionalism. Just a tired man carrying the weight of everything he had destroyed. When he stepped inside, his eyes moved slowly around the bakery like he was seeing it honestly for the first time in years. The wooden counters, the old photographs near the register, the flour dust permanently settled into the cracks of the floorboards, all the things he once tried to distance himself from. "I resigned from the firm," he finally said. I simply nodded and poured coffee into 2 mugs, the same way I had done hundreds of mornings throughout his life. Then Ethan started crying. Not politely, not quietly. Real grief poured out of him all at once. He admitted how deeply he had changed after entering the Whitmore world, how embarrassed he became by Savannah, by the bakery, by me. "I betrayed the person who loved me first." Hearing those words hurt terribly, but strangely, I no longer felt anger. Ethan had already punished himself more brutally than I ever could. I told him something Thomas once said years earlier, that he feared success might someday convince Ethan to forget where he came from. That broke him completely. For a long time, and neither of us spoke after that. Eventually, I walked around the counter and wrapped my arms around my son for the first time since the wedding. The embrace did not erase what happened. Some wounds stay forever, but it was a beginning. At one point, Ethan asked softly whether his father would hate him for everything that happened. I shook my head. No, he would hate what shame did to you. Later that evening, Ethan helped me close the bakery while sunset painted Savannah gold outside the windows. And standing beside my son beneath that fading light, I realized surviving a family sometimes means rebuilding it slowly from ashes, instead of pretending the fire never happened. By spring, life in Savannah finally began feeling steady again. Not perfect. Families do not heal that neatly after devastation, but the sharpness of the pain softened into something quieter, something we could carry without collapsing beneath it every day. Ethan started helping me at the bakery several mornings each week. At first, customers seemed surprised seeing a former Charleston corporate attorney serving peach turnovers behind an old wooden counter. But eventually, people stopped whispering about the scandal and started treating him like somebody rebuilding his life honestly. And for the first time in years, my son no longer seemed ashamed of where he came from. Celeste moved away from Charleston completely after cutting ties with Margaret Whitmore. Occasionally, she mailed handwritten letters to the bakery describing therapy sessions, small apartments, temporary jobs, and the strange relief that comes from finally living without manipulation. I answered every letter. Margaret eventually lost her position at the law firm once investigators uncovered fraudulent trust documents and unauthorized access to private DNA records. Yet strangely, I no longer felt satisfaction watching her fall apart. Too much hatred had already destroyed too many lives. One quiet morning before sunrise, Ethan entered the bakery carrying coffee while I prepared dough beside the counter. He paused beneath the framed photograph of Thomas hanging near the kitchen doorway. Then he said something I knew would stay with me forever. I spent years believing success meant escaping where I came from. Now, I think any success that requires you to despise the people who loved you first is not success at all. I looked at my son standing there in flour-covered clothes, beside the ovens warming slowly behind him, and I realized something important. The truth destroyed our family once, but it also saved what remained of it. As sunlight spread across the streets of Savannah outside the bakery windows, I finally understood that people who truly love you will never ask you to feel ashamed of your own beginnings. And sometimes the hardest thing a family survives is finally stopping the lie they built their lives around. Sometimes the deepest wounds in life do not come from strangers. They come from the people we once trusted to protect our hearts. Pride, shame, and the desire to belong can slowly pull families apart until love becomes almost unrecognizable. But the truth has a strange way of surviving in silence, waiting for the moment when it can finally breathe again. And even after betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, healing is still possible when people choose honesty over appearances and love over status. Some scars never fully disappear, but they can remind us who we are and where we came from. In the end, no amount of wealth or social acceptance is worth losing the people who loved us before the world ever knew our names. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart in any way, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more emotional family stories filled with truth, heartbreak, and hope.